"You don't belong here." 4 words, spoken in a corridor that smelled of floor wax and recycled air, under fluorescent lights that hummed at the frequency of institutional indifference. Spoken loudly enough that the 3 nurses at the station 10 feet away stopped what they were doing. Loudly enough that the medical student near the supply closet looked up from his clipboard. Loudly enough that the orderly pushing a linen cart paused mid-stride, then looked away. Dr. Harlan Voss did not lower his voice. He never did. In 31 years at Meridian University Hospital, he had not once had to. He stood in the middle of the 3rd-floor surgical corridor on a Tuesday morning in October, his white coat pressed and monogrammed, his reading glasses hanging from his breast pocket like a credential, and he looked at the young woman in scrubs before him as though she were a scheduling error, something administrative, something that could be corrected with a phone call. "This is a trauma surgery residency," he said, his voice dropping only slightly, not from discretion but from contempt, the way a man lowers his voice when he wants the words to land harder. "Not a diversity program, not a second chance. You don't belong here, and frankly, I don't know how you got here." The young woman did not move. She held a patient chart against her chest with both hands, her posture straight, her breathing even. She said nothing. The nurses at the station had gone very still. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody intervened. What Dr. Harlan Voss did not know, what none of them knew, standing in that corridor under those humming lights, was who she was. Not really. Not the parts that mattered. He had no idea. And when the truth came out, it did not merely embarrass him. It ended things, quietly, permanently, in the way that only the truth can end things when it has been patient long enough. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. But before we get to what it cost him, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Dr. Camille Okafor really was, and how she came to be standing in that corridor, holding that chart, saying nothing at all. Now, here is what most people did not know about Camille Okafor. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom house on Decatur Street in a part of Birmingham, Alabama that did not appear in travel guides. The house had a front porch that leaned slightly to the left, a garden her mother kept with the seriousness of someone tending something sacred, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of red pepper and onion, and the warmth of a cast-iron skillet that had never fully cooled. Her mother, Adayeza, was a licensed practical nurse who worked double shifts at a county hospital that was understaffed in the ways county hospitals always are. Her father, Emmanuel, drove long-haul freight and was home on weekends when he was home at all. They were not poor in the way that breaks people. They were poor in the way that teaches you what things are actually worth. It was her grandmother, Nkechi, who shaped her. Nkechi had come from Enugu to Birmingham in 1971 with $32, a Bible, and a nursing license that the state of Alabama initially refused to recognize. She had fought that refusal through 3 levels of bureaucracy without a lawyer, without connections, and without raising her voice once. She won. She worked as a nurse for 38 years, retired at 67, and spent her mornings in the garden beside Adayeza and her evenings in a chair by the window reading medical journals she still subscribed to. It was Nkechi who told Camille, when Camille was 9 years old and furious about something that no longer mattered. "Stay low, build high. The tree that survives the storm is not the one that shouts at the wind." Camille had written it on the inside cover of every notebook she owned from that day forward. She was not a prodigy in the way that gets written about. she was something quieter and more durable than that. She graduated valedictorian from her high school in a class that did not expect it of her. She earned a full academic scholarship to Spelman College, majored in biochemistry, and spent her summers volunteering in the trauma unit at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. She applied to 12 medical schools. She was accepted to 9. She chose Johns Hopkins not because of the name, but because of its trauma surgery program, which was the best in the country by 3 separate metrics she had researched herself. At Hopkins, she did not network. She did not perform. She studied. She operated. She logged more simulation hours than any resident in her cohort, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had decided early that mastery was the only currency that could not be devalued by someone else's opinion of her face or her name. She graduated in the top 2% of her class. Her thesis on hemorrhagic shock intervention protocols was cited in a peer-reviewed journal before she had finished her residency application. Her attending at Hopkins, Dr. Miriam Castillo, wrote in her recommendation letter that she had, in 30 years of teaching, never encountered a surgical mind quite like Camille Okafor's, that she moved in the operating room the way certain people move through crises, without urgency, without waste, with a quality of attention that seemed to slow time around her. None of this was visible on the 3rd floor of Meridian University Hospital on that Tuesday morning in October. What was visible was a young black woman in scrubs, holding a chart, saying nothing. And that was enough for Dr. Harlan Voss. Now, let me tell you about the man who said those 4 words, and the world that had spent 3 decades confirming he had the right to say them. Harlan Voss had been chief of trauma surgery at Meridian for 11 years. Before that, deputy chief for 7. Before that, the kind of resident whose confidence outpaced his competence by just enough that people mistook one for the other. He came from a family of physicians. His father had been a surgeon, his grandfather had been a surgeon, and the Voss name appeared on a brass plaque in the hospital's East Wing that had been there since 1987. Harlan walked past it every morning. He was not, by any clinical measure, a bad surgeon. He was technically proficient and experienced in the way that years alone can make you experienced. But he had not published original research in 9 years. He had not updated his hemorrhagic ye intervention protocols in 6. He ran his department with a combination of certainty and incuriosity that his subordinates had learned to navigate the way sailors navigate a reef. Carefully, without drawing attention to the navigation. He had a way of looking at people that sorted them before they spoke. It was faster than thought. It operated on signals he would have called instinct, which is what people call bias when they do not want to examine it. When Camille Okafor had arrived at Meridian's surgical residency program 6 weeks earlier, Voss had looked at her file for 40 seconds. He had noted her school, her scores, her letters. He had set the file down and told his administrative coordinator, Janet Marsh, that he would need to keep a close eye on this one. Janet had written nothing down. What Harlan Voss did not know was that Camille had not chosen Meridian despite his presence. She had chosen it because of a federally funded trauma initiative called the HALO Protocol, a study examining real-time hemorrhagic response in urban trauma settings, being run by a quieter, less decorated researcher named Dr. Priya Anand. 3 separate federal health agencies had called it the most significant trauma research currently underway in the southeastern United States. Camille had read every published preliminary finding. She had corresponded with Dr. Anand twice before applying. She had come to Meridian for the work, not for the name, for the work. Harlan Voss had never read a single page of the Halo Protocol. He ran the department. The department ran the study. That was, in his estimation, the same thing. It was not the same thing. And it was about to matter enormously. The morning of the corridor confrontation had begun before 5 o'clock for Camille. She had been on call the previous night, had assisted in 2 emergency surgeries between midnight and 3, and had spent the remaining hours reviewing case files for the Halo Protocol's weekly data analysis meeting at 9 a.m. She had not slept. She had changed into clean scrubs, drunk 2 cups of coffee that tasted of the vending machine they came from, and gone to retrieve a patient chart from the 3rd-floor station at 6:45. She had been standing there perhaps 90 seconds when Harlan Voss came around the corner. He had not been looking for her. He had been moving between rounds with the velocity of a man who had somewhere to be and wanted everyone to know it. He saw her. He stopped. What followed was not a confrontation in any equal sense of the word. It was a declaration. Voss looked at the chart in her hands, at her name badge, at her face, and something in his expression shifted from velocity to certainty. He asked what she was doing on his floor. She told him she was a 2nd-year surgical resident assigned to the trauma rotation. He asked who had assigned her. She gave him the name of the residency director, Dr. Elliot Marsh. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said it. "You don't belong here." The nurses at the station heard every word. The medical student heard every word. The orderly heard every word. Not one of them spoke. Camille looked at Voss for exactly as long as it took to understand that he had finished speaking. Then she looked back at the chart, made a notation, replaced it in the rack, and said in a voice that was level and entirely without effect, "Thank you, Dr. Voss." She walked back toward the resident workroom. She never raised her voice. She did not look back. She did not report it that morning. She went to the Halo Protocol meeting at 9 o'clock and presented 17 pages of hemorrhagic response data with a precision that made Dr. Priya Anand pause mid-note and look up from her legal pad. But what had happened in that corridor did not disappear. It had witnesses. It had a name badge and a timestamp and 3 people who had stood still while it happened and would spend the next several weeks deciding what that stillness made them. One of them would not wait that long. Her name was Deja Simmons. She was a 3rd-year float nurse on the surgical floor, and she had been standing at the station that morning close enough to feel the change in the air when Voss stopped walking. She had heard every word. She had done what everyone else did, which was nothing, and she had spent the rest of her shift carrying that nothing like a stone in her pocket. Deja knew what it meant to be watched differently in those hallways. She knew what it cost to speak. She also knew, with a clarity that had been sharpening since that morning, that silence had its own cost, and that the cost was not distributed evenly. That evening, after her shift, Deja went to the office of Dr. Elliot Marsh, the residency director. She sat down and told him, in exact words, what she had heard. She did not editorialize. She did not speculate about motive. She stated what was said, who said it, and who was present. Dr. Elliot Marsh was a careful man, not a crusader. But he had been a physician for 29 years, and he understood that what Deja Simmons had just described was not a personality conflict. He thanked her. He told her she had done the right thing. He opened a file on his computer and began to type. Deja Simmons walked back to her car that night with the stone gone from her pocket. She did not know yet what it would cost her to have put it down, but she had put it down, and that was the beginning. Elliot Marsh moved carefully, which in institutional terms is the only way to move when the person you are investigating has 11 years of authority and a brass plaque in the East Wing. He pulled the residency assignment records, reviewed Camille's evaluations from the preceding 6 weeks, which were, without exception, either strong or exceptional, and noted that the one evaluation that was neither bore the initials HV. It had been filed 4 days after Camille's arrival. He filed a formal inquiry under the hospital's Title VII compliance framework and brought it to General Counsel, a methodical woman named Patricia Howe, who read his documentation and said very quietly, "How long has this been going on?" It was not a question. The answer was longer than anyone wanted to say out loud. Patricia Howe had been general counsel at Meridian for 14 years, and she had learned to read institutional silence the way a cardiologist reads an EKG, not for what it said, but for what it withheld. She pulled Voss's personnel file and read it in full, which took 2 hours, which told her something by itself. There were 3 prior complaints. 2 had been resolved informally, which in institutional language means they had been absorbed. 1 had resulted in a mandatory sensitivity training that Voss had completed on paper and, by every available evidence, nowhere else. She made a list of names. She began to make calls. She did not tell Harlan Voss she was making them. And Harlan Voss, in those same days, continued as he always had. He ran his rounds. He walked past the brass plaque each morning with the ease of a man who has never had reason to question whether the floor beneath him was solid. He did not know it had already begun to shift. But it was about to get worse. And it was about to get worse in a way that was entirely, irreversibly his own doing. The second incident happened on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the first. Camille had been in the simulation lab running hemorrhagic response drills when she was paged to the 3rd-floor trauma bay for a consult. The patient was a 43-year-old man with a penetrating abdominal injury, unstable vitals, and a narrow window. The attending on call was a second-year fellow named Dr. James Osei, a Ghanaian-American physician who had joined Meridian 8 months earlier, and who had developed a quiet reputation for both clinical precision and an equally precise awareness of which rooms in that hospital were safe to be himself in. James Osei had called Camille specifically. He had seen her work. He trusted her judgment in a way that had nothing to do with seniority and everything to do with evidence. They were midway through the consult, Camille at the patient's left, James at the monitor, a scrub tech named Marcus Webb at the instrument tray, when Harlan Voss walked in. He had not been paged. He had been passing the bay on his way to a department meeting and had seen, through the glass, a face he had already decided did not belong. He pushed through the door. The room smelled of antiseptic and the specific metallic sharpness of a body working too hard to stay alive. He looked at Camille. He looked at James. He looked at the patient on the table. "Who authorized this consult?" he said. It was not a question. James Osei did not look up from the monitor. "I did. Dr. Okafor is on the trauma rotation. The consult is documented." Voss looked at Camille. "Step back from the patient." The room went still. Marcus Webb's hand stopped moving above the instrument tray. The monitor continued its uneven cadence. Camille did not step back. She kept her eyes on the chart, her hands at her sides, her breathing unchanged. "I'm going to need you to step back," Voss said again, his voice carrying the register of a man who has never had to say something twice and is experiencing the repetition as a personal offense. James Osei set down his pen. He turned from the monitor and looked at Voss with the measured steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this moment without ever expecting it to arrive. "Dr. Voss, The patient is unstable. Dr. Okafor's consult is within protocol. If you have a concern about the assignment, I'd ask that you raise it after we've stabilized him." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that was not clinical. "This is my department, and I'm telling you both that this consult ends now." He said it in front of Marcus Webb. He said it in front of a scrub tech named Rosa Delgado, who had come in behind him to check the supply cart. He said it in front of the patient, who was conscious enough to hear it, whose eyes moved from Voss to Camille, with the confused fear of someone who does not understand why the people trying to help him are being interrupted. Camille looked at the patient. She looked at the monitor. She said 4 words. "He needs a surgeon." Quiet, factual, aimed at no one and at everyone. Voss stepped toward her. "I will have security remove you from this floor." And then James Osei did something that would cost him, that he had known would cost him, and that he did anyway. He stepped between Voss and Camille. He was not large, he was not loud, he simply occupied the space. "Then you'll need to remove me first, because I'm not ending this consult." Voss stared at him. The monitor beeped. The patient's blood pressure dropped 2 points. Camille said nothing further. She turned back to the patient and did what she had been trained to do, with a quality of attention that made Marcus Webb understand something he had not fully understood before, about the difference between a person who performs competence and a person who simply is it. Harlan Voss left the room. He did not call security. He walked back down the corridor with the velocity of a man who has somewhere to be, and he did not look back. But Rosa Delgado had a very clear memory and a very clear conscience. She filed an incident report that afternoon, in the precise, unadorned language of someone who has learned that the most powerful testimony does not reach for drama because it does not need to. Rosa Delgado's incident report landed on Patricia Howe's desk before 5 o'clock. Howe read it twice. Then she called the hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Sandra Reyes, and said, "We need to meet, tonight if possible." It was possible. Now, here is what most people at Meridian did not know about the HALO protocol. They knew it was federally funded. They knew Dr. Priya Anand's name in the vague way people know things that do not affect them directly. What they did not know, what Harlan Voss certainly did not know, because he had never sat down with the study documentation, was that the funding agreement contained a specific institutional accountability clause, standard language, the kind drafted by lawyers, signed by administrators, and filed in a drawer because it almost never becomes relevant. The clause stated that the receiving institution was required to maintain a research environment free of discriminatory conduct toward any personnel engaged in the funded study, and that documented violations could trigger a federal compliance review and suspension of funding. The HALO protocol was funded at $4.7 million over 3 years. It was in its second year. It had produced preliminary findings that 3 federal health agencies had already cited in policy guidance. It was the most valuable thing currently happening inside Meridian University Hospital. Camille Okafor was a named research contributor on the HALO protocol. Dr. Priya Anand had added her to the study roster 6 weeks earlier, the same week she arrived at Meridian. Her name was on the federal documentation. Her contributions were logged and time-stamped. She was, in the language of the funding agreement, protected personnel. Harlan Voss had never read the funding agreement. He ran the department. The department housed the study. That was, in his estimation, the same thing. It was not the same thing. Patricia Howe understood this with an immediacy that produced a very specific kind of institutional dread. Not the dread of wrongdoing discovered, but of wrongdoing committed in plain sight of a loaded clause that nobody had thought to check. She pulled the funding agreement that evening, read the accountability clause twice, and cross-referenced the dates of Voss's documented conduct against the date of Camille's addition to the study roster. The timeline was unambiguous. Every incident had occurred after Camille became protected personnel under a federal research agreement. Every incident had witnesses. Every incident was documented. Dr. Sandra Reyes arrived at Patricia Howe's office at 7:45. She was a compact, precise woman who had run Meridian's clinical operations for 6 years, and who did not involve herself in departmental politics unless they became a clinical or legal liability. They had become both. She read the documentation without interruption. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the wall for a moment, in the way people look at walls when they are looking at something that is not there. "How many people saw the Trauma Bay incident?" she said. "3 documented witnesses. 1 incident report already filed." Reyes nodded once. "And the federal exposure?" "Real," Howe said. "If the funding agency initiates a review and finds what we have, they will suspend, possibly terminate." Reyes stood and straightened in her jacket. "I want a full administrative review initiated by Monday morning. I want Voss notified through counsel, and I want Dr. Okafor's status in the program formally confirmed in writing before her next shift." She paused at the door. "And Patricia, make sure Dr. Anand knows her study is protected. Whatever happens next, the Halo protocol does not stop." She left. Patricia Howe sat alone with the documentation spread across her desk, and the particular quality of institutional silence that settles over a building when something that has been wrong for a long time is finally being named. The fluorescent light above her hummed faintly. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty, and somewhere in the resident wing, a young woman who had not slept in 36 hours was reviewing hemorrhagic response data by the light of a laptop screen, her grandmother's words written on the inside cover of the notebook open beside her. "Stay low, build high. The tree that survives the storm is not the one that shouts at the wind." Camille had not shouted. She had not retaliated. She had not asked anyone to fight for her, though 2 people had chosen to anyway. One who had stepped between her and a threat in a trauma bay, and one who had walked into an office after her shift and put a stone down on a desk. She had simply continued to work, and the work had accumulated, quietly, the way all real things accumulate, until it was impossible to ignore. The administrative review began on Monday morning, as Dr. Sandra Reyes had promised, and it moved with the quiet, inexorable momentum of a process that has been a long time coming and has, at last, been given permission to arrive. Harlan Voss was notified through counsel at 8:47 a.m. His attorney, Gerald Fitch, called him while he was in the East Wing corridor 20 feet from the brass plaque. Voss listened. He said very little. He walked to his office, closed the door, and sat down in the way that men sit down when the floor they have always trusted has announced, without drama, that it is no longer entirely there. He had been chief of trauma surgery for 11 years. He had never been reviewed. Patricia Howe had built the review carefully, from the corridor confrontation witnessed by 3 people, the trauma bay intervention witnessed by 3 more, the evaluation filed 4 days after Camille's arrival, and beneath all of it, the federal accountability clause that transformed every incident from an internal personnel matter into a potential federal compliance violation. She had retained outside counsel and contacted the federal funding agency's compliance office. Their response arrived within 48 hours. It was, in the estimation of everyone who read it, unambiguous. Sandra Reyes shared it with the board of directors. The board read it in a conference room that smelled of coffee and the particular tension of people handed a document they cannot unfold and fold back up again. The vote was not close. Harlan Voss was placed on administrative leave. His clinical duties were suspended. His access to the residency program was revoked. The review itself took 11 weeks, conducted by an outside firm staffed by 2 employment attorneys and a medical ethics consultant named Dr. Josephine Trask, who had spent 20 years examining institutional bias in academic medicine, and who read the Voss file with the attention of someone who has seen this shape of thing before and is not surprised by it, only tired. They interviewed 22 people. They reviewed 9 years of personnel records. They sorted Voss's resident evaluations by race and gender and compared the language. The pattern was not subtle. It was not ambiguous. It was the kind of pattern that, once seen, cannot be unseen, and that the people absorbing complaints for 9 years had, in their own way, already seen and chosen not to name. Dr. Josephine Trask named it, in writing, in a report that ran to 47 pages. The report found a sustained pattern of discriminatory conduct toward residents of color over not less than 7 years. It found that prior complaints had been inadequately investigated. It found that both the corridor confrontation and the trauma bay intervention constituted documented violations of the hospital's anti-discrimination policy and the Federal Accountability Clause. It recommended termination of Harlan Voss's employment, a formal review of the residency program's complaint procedures, and notification of the federal funding agency. The board accepted every recommendation. Harlan Voss was terminated. Not resigned. Not retired with a ceremony and a plaque of his own, terminated. Gerald Fitch had argued for a negotiated departure. The board declined. Patricia Howe made clear, in the measured language of someone who does not need to raise her voice to be heard, that a negotiated departure was not consistent with the findings of the report. Voss did not come back to the building. His office was cleared by a facilities staff member on a Tuesday afternoon. The brass plaque in the East Wing was removed the following week. No ceremony, no announcement. The wall where it had been was painted over, and for a brief period there was a rectangle of slightly brighter paint where it had hung, which faded over time to match the wall around it. Certainty. Gone. James Osei was not disciplined. The review found his conduct in the trauma bay consistent with the ethical obligations of a physician to a patient in his care. Dr. Sandra Reyes met with him personally, thanked him, and told him, with the directness of someone who has learned that vague reassurances are their own kind of insult, that what he had done in that room had mattered, and that the institution knew it. James Osei nodded. He said very little. He went back to work. Deja Simmons was offered a permanent position on the surgical floor, moving from float status to a full-time role with the seniority protections that came with it. She accepted. She signed the paperwork, put the pen down, and went to check on her patients. She had put the stone down, and the stone had become something else entirely. The HALO protocol continued. Dr. Priya Anand presented its second-year findings at a federal health research symposium in Washington, D.C., and the preliminary data drew the kind of attention that translates, in the language of federal health policy, into citations, into funding, into change. Camille Okafor's contributions were listed in the presentation. Her name appeared in the published findings. Her name appeared for the first time in a journal that people in trauma surgery read. It would not be the last time. Now, let me tell you about the Thursday afternoon in November, when the same hospital that had once hummed with institutional indifference did something it had never done before. The board of directors of Meridian University Hospital voted unanimously to name a newly renovated surgical wing in honor of a member of the institution's community. The resolution, drafted by Patricia Howe and signed by every board member present, cited extraordinary contributions to trauma medicine research, demonstrated commitment to patient welfare under conditions of institutional pressure, and the embodiment of values the hospital aspired to hold. The language was formal, the meaning was not complicated. The wing would be called the Camille Okafor Surgical Research Wing. The same hospital, the same corridors, the same fluorescent lights that hummed at the frequency of institutional indifference. The same third floor where a young woman in scrubs had stood with a chart against her chest and heard 4 words spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You don't belong here." 4 words, spoken in October, answered in November, not with anger, not with argument, but with a brass nameplate and a dedication ceremony and in a room full of people who had come to see something named that had been true for a long time without a name. The atrium smelled of fresh paint and cut flowers and the particular warmth of a crowd assembled for something it believes in. The dedication ceremony was held on a Thursday afternoon in that same year, the same year he had said those 4 words, and the room was full. Administrators and physicians and residents and nurses and the kind of quiet, attentive crowd that assembles when something is being named that people have been waiting without knowing it for a long time to see named. Deja Simmons stood near the back in her new permanent staff badge. James Osei stood 3 rows from the front. Dr. Priya Anand sat beside Patricia Howe. 3 representatives from the Federal Health Research Office occupied the 3rd row with their notebooks open. On the wall, beside the entrance to the wing, a new brass nameplate had been mounted that morning. It read, Camille Okafor Surgical Research Wing. The metal was bright and unhurried, the way new things are before the world has had time to dull them. Dr. Sandra Reyes spoke first. She stood at the podium and said, without preamble, that institutions are not buildings. They are the choices made inside them. She said it plainly. She meant it plainly. Dr. Priya Anand spoke next. She described what Camille had contributed to the HALO protocol in terms that were clinical and specific and that made the federal representatives in the 3rd row take notes without looking up. She said that the preliminary hemorrhagic response data Camille had helped generate had already been cited in 2 federal policy guidance documents and was currently informing trauma protocols in 11 hospitals across 4 states. She said this without theater, because the facts did not require it. Then it was Camille's turn. She walked to the podium in a room that had once been a building she had chosen for the work, not the name. She stood for a moment without speaking, not from hesitation but from the particular stillness of someone who has learned that silence, deployed correctly, is not absence, it is weight. She spoke for 7 minutes. She did not mention Harlan Voss by name. She did not describe the corridor or the chart or the 4 words. She did not mention the trauma bay or the brass plaque that was no longer on the wall in the East Wing. She did not need to. every person in that atrium already knew. And the ones who had been in that corridor on a Tuesday morning in October, the nurses who had gone still, the medical student who had looked up from his clipboard, the orderly who had looked away, they were in that room too, and they carried the weight of their own stillness, and that was its own reckoning, quieter than any report. She spoke about her grandmother, Nkechi, who had come from Enugu to Birmingham in 1971 with $32 and a nursing license that Alabama had initially refused to recognize, and who had fought that refusal through 3 levels of bureaucracy without a lawyer, without connections, and without raising her voice once. She spoke about a garden on Decatur Street that smelled of red pepper and the warmth of something tended with seriousness. She spoke about a sentence written on the inside cover of every notebook she had ever owned. She said it aloud once in that atrium, in a voice that was level and entirely without effect. "Stay low, build high. The tree that survives the storm is not the one that shouts at the wind." The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet at all. Camille flew home to Birmingham that weekend. She sat on the front porch of the house on Decatur Street, the one that leaned slightly to the left, with her grandmother beside her in the evening light. Nkechi was 81 years old and still subscribed to 2 medical journals. She had watched the dedication ceremony on a laptop Adaeze had set up on the kitchen table, and she had said nothing during it, which was the thing she did when something moved her past the reach of words. They sat together as the light went. The garden was still there. The cast-iron skillet had not fully cooled. Somewhere down Decatur Street, a child was riding a bicycle in the last of the daylight. Nkechi reached over and put her hand on Camille's. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Camille looked at the garden. She thought about the corridor on the 3rd floor and the chart she had held against her chest, and the words spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear, and the silence that followed them, and the 2 people who had chosen, each in their own way, to break it. She thought about the work. She thought about 47 pages of a report that had named, finally and in writing, something that had been true for 9 years without a name. She thought about a wing of a hospital that now bore her name, not as an apology, not as a gesture, but as a fact. Permanent, institutional, mounted in brass on the wall of the same building where a man had looked at her and spoken his verdict aloud. Earned through restraint, not with anger, not with revenge. With every hour she had chosen the work over the wound. This is not a story about one hospital or one corridor or one man who looked at a young woman and decided, in less time than it takes to draw a breath, that she did not belong. This is a story about what happens every single day in rooms that smell of floor wax and recycled air, in offices and boardrooms and operating theaters and classrooms. Wherever someone with authority and certainty and a name on a plaque looks at a person they have already sorted and speaks the verdict aloud. What they never account for is the work. The quiet, invisible, accumulated work of a person who was told, in 100 different ways in 100 different rooms, that they did not belong, and who responded each time not with anger, not with retaliation, but with the next hour of study, the next simulation drill, the next page of data, the next notation in a chart. Dignity is not passive. It is the most disciplined thing a person can carry. Camille Okafor's name is on a wing of that hospital now. The same year he said she did not belong, the same institution put her name on its walls. Not someday. That year, that November, while the paint was still bright where his plaque used to hang, he had said 4 words in October. The hospital answered with a nameplate in November, and the nameplate will outlast the memory of the man who thought he could decide who belonged. If you were standing in that corridor on that October morning, what would you have done? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every week on this channel, we find the people the world overlooked and tell their stories. If that matters to you, subscribe. We will be here.